You are now listening to Protecting Your Nest with board-certified family medicine and obesity medicine specialist Dr. Tony Hampton. For more, visit drtonyhampton.com. Welcome to the Protecting Your Nest podcast. Today, I have the privilege of having a guest who is living in a magical city of Kansas. And yeah, I had to say that. Kansas City is not exactly Wamego. Did I say Wamego correctly, Doc? Kansas, yeah. In fact, it's about an hour and 39 minutes away from that famous place we call the Wizard of Oz land. And but she's doing some magic herself, and I wanted to bring her aboard today to talk a little bit about metabolic dysfunction. And that person is Dr. Cecily Anne Clark-Ganheart, and she is a maternal-fetal and obesity medicine physician sharing her talents with the world as it relates to obesity medicine and intermittent fasting. She's actually known as the fasting doctor. And the question is, how do I know her? Well, we were both featured on a blog on the Metabolic Multiplier website, and it was entitled Leaders in Metabolic Health, Keto, and Black Culture, and it was written by Cecil Seth. Also featured, believe it or not, was the CEO of the ADA, Tracy Brown. Now, Tracy has also benefited from a low-carb diet and confessed on the Fasting Lane podcast that she was able to get off insulin with a low-carb diet. So if you think I'm pulling your leg on that one, just check out the Fasting Lane podcast. And that's where she shared this great news about getting off insulin. And that episode was released around February 12th of 2020. So I would definitely check that out because it kind of sent shockwaves through the low-carb community to hear the CEO of the ADA confessing that the low-carb lifestyle got her off insulin. So today we're going to talk about a broad number of topics, and we just flipped the tables, and anybody that follows me knows that I do a post-podcast YouTube and Facebook Live, but we decided to do a pre-podcast discussion during which we kind of dove into those topics around intermittent fasting. So I'll provide a link in the show notes so you can check that out. And if you have thoughts about intermittent fasting from the fasting doctor, that'll be the YouTube and Facebook Live you want to check out. I really appreciate you, Dr. Cecily Anne, joining me, and tell your husband and your two boys, I owe them big time for allowing you to spend some time with me to record the podcast. And I really appreciate that. So welcome to Protecting Your Nest. And how has your day been so far?
It's going well. It's been great. We actually have a third son now. We just had Wyatt in October of last year, so he's almost a one.
Nice.
Yeah, just bridging today, telemedicine, and then after that, running the kids around to practices and whatnot.
Oh my God, busy. And man, I'm assuming that you were looking for a girl, and
No, you know what? Actually, we were fine with having
you're okay.
another boy because we have clothes now forever. Like
That's a good point.
we don't have to buy anything new.
That's right. That's right. That is excellent planning. So good job there. So, so I love that. And I appreciate, I just love boys. Mine are 21 and 23 now, but it's just, boys are in some ways easier. So, I mean, I think that'll be great. And you got your little team there going. So congratulations. And I know that'll go well for you. So I'm curious, I know you've had a lot of successes with lifestyle modification. So why don't you tell the listeners who may not know you how you got from where you were before you started these lifestyle changes to where you are today?
Yeah, so I started intermittent fasting in 2017. In 2017, I was really looking to try to take control of my health. I had lost a little bit of weight, but it just, always seemed like it would come back I'd be heavier than I was previously, before I lost weight. And so I started intermittent fasting after reading the book, The Obesity Code. And then since that time, continued to just refine my approach, refine my diet. There is also a book called Deep Nutrition, which I read shortly after the Obesity Code, which really talked about eating more ancestral, more a whole foods lifestyle, which for most people is a variation of low carb, whether you label it that or not. And so just by putting some of those principles into play, and then really looking at some of my other factors, stressors, whatnot, I was able to lose goodness, from my highest weight, which would have been 264, I was able to lose 80 pounds,
Mm.
all with just lifestyle interventions, lifestyle modifications.
I love it. I have not read Deep Nutrition yet, so I'm jotting it down as you're talking. So that'll be on my list of books. Hopefully, they have an audiobook. I do a lot of listening these
They
days in the
do.
car.
Yes.
And so thank you for that. And I just thought about one of my other favorite books. I don't know if you read the book, The Oz Principle. It has nothing to
I
do
haven't
with
read
low
it yet.
carb or, yeah, and I think about you and, where you located, and I'm joking about the Wizard of Oz, but it's written by Craig Hickman, Roger Connors, and maybe I think there's another author. But I think the message in the book, it talks about when people, this is one of the leadership things I did, and it talked about personal ownership of the organizational goals and to accept responsibility for your individual performance to help the organization achieve its goals. And what I liked about the book is that it also applies in other areas of your life. So it's one of those. And what's cool about the story, for anybody that hasn't read it, they literally take each character in the book and use those characters as a principle to teach you. So it's really a well-written book, and definitely one to share with the family, even as those youngsters get a little older, because that story is so familiar. I think they'll get a kick out of it. Not the one that's one, but the ones that are a little bit older. I think you'll like that. So put that on your to-do list as well. I do want to touch briefly, since you are a doc who deals with high-risk pregnancies, just want to ask you a few quick questions, just real quick, just to touch on those. So many of your patients come to you during a time when they're expecting to gain weight during their pregnancy. It seems odd that a physician with training in maternal-fetal medicine would be board certified in obesity medicine. Just explain that paradox. It just seems odd that you would be experts in those two separate areas.
Yeah, so obesity, is a manifestation of insulin resistance. And so we find that many conditions that have insulin resistance at its core, such as like your cardiovascular disease, hypertension, your diabetes, etc., all of those diseases can negatively impact pregnancy. And so, by getting a handle on those diseases prior to pregnancy and actually optimizing your health prior to pregnancy, that can help you to go on to have a successful pregnancy, or a pregnancy with fewer complications than if you would have not changed your lifestyle or started to improve upon your lifestyle before becoming pregnant. And so, because I tend to treat women who are having pregnancy complications, many of them are due to pre existing lifestyle factors that have led to disease. I thought, well, wouldn't it be cool if I could reach women prior to conception to help them use lifestyle modification to address these conditions so that maybe they're not a high risk pregnancy when they decide to conceive?
That makes a lot of sense, and that should be a pretty standard thing. So I'm happy that you kind of figured out, well, let's take some of this knowledge and apply it, because I think people traditionally wouldn't think of your specialty as one that would be, focused on this type of way of thinking. So And I imagine when you meet patients and you're talking the language of nutrition, they're probably expecting you to talk about balance with nutrition, because that's what most nutritional professionals talk about. You need balanced meals. In your practice, I know you tend to focus on reducing certain macronutrients. And for both of us, it's probably carbs, right? So when you talk to patients who are pregnant, is it advisable to talk about carb restriction during pregnancy, or is that something you tend to avoid?
No, it is reasonable to talk about carbohydrate restriction, because if you think about like gestational diabetes, the gestational diabetic diet is a form of a carb restricted diet. I think people traditionally have in their mind that unless you are less than 20 grams of carbs a day, that you're not in a low carb diet. Low carb has many different forms. Now, you may not be restricting your carbohydrates enough to stay in ketosis, you know what I mean, around the clock. But you can still have low carb, even if your carbohydrate intake is above 20 grams of carbs a day, especially when you look at the average American eats anywhere from 300 plus grams of carbs a day. Even cutting that in half is the beginning of some form of carbohydrate restriction. So, we definitely work with patients. And when someone, again, is diagnosed with gestational diabetes, that's one of the first things we do is put them on a modified low carbohydrate diet.
That makes a lot of sense. So, I also assume that because you are dealing with a lot of patients who are high risk, I remember, actually, you may not know this, Doc, but I did a maternal child health fellowship. And so as a family doctor, I did high risk OB relative to a family doctor. I did C-sections, tubals, and I did that at West Suburban Hospital in Oak Park. So I actually was a family doctor who delivered babies and did C-sections and all of that stuff for the first half of my career. And some of my patients would have problems with nausea and things like that. Many of them would, not be feeling well, so they wouldn't necessarily cook. They didn't feel like cooking. And then when they did eat, they eat a lot of processed food. So are there things do you tell your patients about processed foods and tips on, not, avoiding them? How do you deal with that when people are struggling and don't want to really cook and do things like that?
Yeah, I try to encourage people just to keep it simple. And people have different, suggestions or whatnot, but just as a easy, like basic place to start, I'll have people, you have your plate and it's a circle, and you'll split half your plate, and that'll be some form of protein. Whether you want to mix plant proteins, animal proteins, what have you, but half your plate, a form of protein. And then your other half, split that into half. So it's like a fourth and a fourth on the other side of the plate. And that's your fruit and that's your vegetables. And if you're hungry, go back and get either more vegetables or go back and get more protein. And finding simple ways to prepare things is key. I think a lot of times we feel like, we have to have a recipe book and make elaborate recipes. But if you're grabbing real single ingredient, whole foods, that could be baking fish in the oven that you can just turn on, and it basically cooks itself in, 10 to 15, 20 minutes.
Yeah.
And then you have a side of, vegetables, green vegetables with it that you sauteed. Again, shouldn't take more than 5 or 10 minutes to saute vegetables in olive oil or avocado oil or what have you. And so those are things we try to get people to see, that a meal can be raw foods. A meal doesn't have to be something that you spent an hour and a half cooking, and really try to get people to simplify their meal planning and meal prep.
Yeah, I think simplification is the key to how I practice as well. And I've been able to move the needle with patients by keeping things simple, and it really helps me as well. And even as I think about what I'm going to eat when we're done, it was literally just, I threw a whole lot of chicken in the oven and I threw a whole lot of vegetables in the oven. And that was it. And there were just non starchy items with the vegetables. So it's very simple. And when you're preparing meals, I think about, last question related to my pregnant, friends and family members. It's funny how, you know, when we have a pregnancy, we're dealing with a baby, we're really trying to have this like really perfect diet for them so that they're healthy. And then they get older, they go to school, they go to their friends' parties, and all of a sudden it seems like we let the guards down. And it's not that we don't care, it just seems like, well, the kids should have fun and we shouldn't restrict them. So what's your thoughts on just the basic philosophy around what the kids are eating versus what the adults are eating?
Yeah, and so I touch on this, especially with my gestational diabetic patients, because a lot of people don't realize that if you have gestational diabetes during pregnancy, your offspring are actually at increased risk for type 2 diabetes and metabolic disease and obesity later in life, just from your exposure. And so, what I tell people is that, if you say you're cleaning up your diet, and so you won't eat it because it's not healthy for you. Why would you feed that to your kids? If it's not healthy for you, it's not healthy for your kids. And so the more that on a regular basis you can keep that stuff out of your house, then yes, when they go to a birthday party, because presumably they're not going to birthday parties every week, especially right now, they're definitely not going to birthday parties every week. So at that point, you don't have to follow them around and say, don't eat that, don't eat this, because on a day to day basis, that is not how they're eating. But if you're keeping the fruit snacks and the different tart treats and all these processed little snacks in the house, and they're eating those every day, and then they go out and they're eating them with their friends every day, yeah, you're not setting them up for lifelong metabolic health. And actually you're not teaching them how they should actually eat. And they're going to struggle with that through adulthood.
Yeah, I agree. And you said my now one of my favorite words, which is metabolic health. And so and for those who are listening, I found the doctor because we were both featured on the Metabolic Multiplier website. And so if you just type in Metabolic Multiplier and you type in leaders and I think it said keto and Black culture, things like that. You'll find that article with some links to the work we're doing. I'm curious if you could just what does metabolic health mean to you?
So to me, it means being, in a state where not only your body can process food optimally, but that during your resting periods, so for instance, when you're fasting, that your body is also functioning optimally. So that would include having low levels of baseline insulin. Insulin in itself is not a bad thing, but the problem is because of our lifestyles and because we have become metabolically unhealthy, insulin is being secreted at higher and higher levels than what it was originally designed to function in the body. So, really, if we can just restore our bodily processes to the way they were intended to work, you'll notice the absence of disease, or at least the improving of disease, depending on how long you've had your condition.
That sounds good. I definitely have learned that metabolic health is really going to be the key for us. And fortunately, for those who suffer from chronic disease, most of those things are easily, well, I shouldn't say easily, but they're reversible. You can do really well by reducing insulin resistance and improving your metabolic health. So I think that's key. And I just wanted to just make sure I think we have to say it over and over again for those who are new to that term, that they have a sense of what it means. So I'm going to ask you a few quicker questions. I want to just make sure I touch on a variety of things. And most of it is obviously lifestyle. It's more about your philosophy about certain things and what that means. I know we touched on snacking already, but I wanted to ask you a little bit about eat, when hungry or eat on a schedule. What's your thoughts about when we should eat? What's your basic philosophy?
I think we should eat when we're hungry. because hunger is supposed to be a natural cue for us. The problem is that we think we're hungry, but we're actually not. A lot of times we eat just because it's time. And so if you condition yourself to look at the clock and it's a certain time to eat, you find yourself maybe air quotes hungry. But at the same time, you'll notice if you're working through a busy day, how you just may happen to eat lunch, 3 hours later than what you normally do. And that's because you really aren't hungry at quote unquote lunchtime. You're just eating because society says we should eat at lunchtime. So I think once you're able to hone in on your hunger cues, if you're hungry, you should eat. And if you're not hungry, you shouldn't.
Yeah, I like that. Keep it simple. And one thing I like about fasting today, and we're recording this towards the end of the day, I didn't have my first meal until 5:39. Typically, we'll have it at lunch during the YouTube. We talked about how it's kind of hard to get in enough calories when you have a narrow eating window. But so I'll probably eat after we talk. But I just love the fact that during the day I was busy and I just wasn't hungry because my body's accustomed to fasting. So I really, really love that part of it. Some of my patients are worried, though, when I start talking about low carb and they've heard that you have to be grass fed and all of these things to be healthy. How is it that a person can adopt maybe a low carb lifestyle? I know fasting's cheap, but when you're eating low carb and you're trying to be healthy, is it expensive? How do you deal with the economics of a low carb diet?
So I think it's just kind of reframing your mind on what you're spending your money on. So, I am biased. I I live in Kansas, so I have access to plenty of farms. So there is a grass-fed, grass-finished all beef farm that is literally like 40 minutes from my house. So we buy
Yep.
a half a cow a year. We have a deep freezer. It's because we buy it in bulk, it's probably half the price of what we would pay if we were buying it in the store.
Wow.
And that's how we, get our cow, and that's how it's affordable. Now, that I know that's not an option for everyone. So the thing that you look at are start by looking at what is affordable. Honestly, a lot of times fish is affordable. You can do, like your tilapias, things like that, your cod, those tend not to be as expensive. You can do beef, even if it's not grass fed or grass finished. But you may dabble in once a month, maybe purchasing grass fed products if that interests you. Same thing for chicken, if you're looking at that, trying to find ones that, if possible, are antibiotic free or hormone free, things like that. But they are more expensive than your traditional varieties. I will say at the end of the day, I don't strongly believe that people are metabolically unhealthy because they didn't have access to grass fed or grass finished, steak. I think it really is more of the processed foods that we're eating, the things out of the package, the things that are food like substances that aren't actually really food that our body doesn't know what to do with it. So don't worry about if you're not shopping, at Whole Foods or wherever. Honestly, a lot of those places are overpriced. If you're just focusing
Yep.
on eating real foods, that's going to go a long way.
Yep. Um, I think we all follow the thought leaders, and you started your journey with Dr. Fong with the Obesity Code and his intermittent fasting book. And I try to learn from Dr. Eric Westman. I think he's at Duke, and he's been doing this type of lifestyle stuff for 20 plus years. So we have to, and he does research, and he would also argue that, in fact, I heard him recently say that when he does his metabolic markers, the things that we measure, like the triglycerides, for instance, he says that it doesn't. He has people who literally are eating like bunless burgers at a fast food, and their metabolic markers still improve. It's
Right.
like yeah. So it's like, so what you're saying is exactly what he said when I heard him recently talk about this. So for those who are listening, the benefits of grass-fed and, things like that are probably real. I mean, you're probably going to get more omega-3 versus omega-6 and things like that. But to use that as a barrier, and we don't even know if we have adequate research to suggest that it's that much of it, the benefit is so substantial that it's worth, paying twice the cost. So until we move into the country like my guest, which I'm so jealous that you can do that, I really think we should just focus on get rid of the starchy and sugary food. So as a expert on intermittent fasting, you probably also have things beyond just intermittent fasting and low carb that you advise your patients. So are there other things that you have found that help people get results in terms of being metabolically healthy?
Yeah, so I do want to speak about exercise just briefly because I think when you first are introduced to intermittent fasting, you will hear lots of the stories where people are like, I lost weight and I didn't even have to exercise. And so it's almost as if you'll hear people saying, don't exercise. And I think exercise for general metabolic health, while it may not be the end all factor for weight loss, we're talking about being metabolically healthy, and that goes beyond the scale. So, physical activity, we are extremely sedentary. We are probably more sedentary now than we've ever been at any point in human history. So, remember, 100 years ago, people didn't have to join CrossFit to work out. They just got up and did their chores on the farm, right? And they were working and doing things all day. So I do think we need to find ways to add back physical activity in our lives, whether that's you using your lunch break, especially if you're fasting, using your lunch break to go for a 20-minute walk rather than, sitting in the break room and eating whatever's there with everyone else, or at after dinner in the evenings, if you want to go walk, for 30 minutes. It doesn't have to be anything extraneous, but we have those studies that also show that physical activity assist with upregulating autophagy. And so I do think that adding physical activity and then all of the things that you talk about as well in terms of stress relief and sleep and all of these other lifestyle factors, we need to make sure to pay attention to those factors as well.
Yeah, but and I actually did master exercise, and when I say master, consistently do it maybe every other day until about 2 years ago, and I'm 52 now, and I feel like 32, and the exercise is one of the things that really made me kind of feel much better. Just when you walk down the hallway, when you climb the stairs, just the regular activities that you do, you just feel so much better doing it. And as we've learned in our obesity boards training, we learned that exercise is the best, weight loss maintenance tool. So if we use exercise to maintain our weight loss as well, and as we get older, hopefully we won't fall and crack our hip because our quadricep muscles are strong. So I definitely agree 100% with that. And one of the things we learned in medical school, and probably in the media, is this idea of calories in equals calories out. I'm curious, what you learned in your obesity training about that way of thinking.
In terms of the obesity, sorry, my son came in. I'm sorry. But
Oh, no, you're good. No, keep it.
I looked at him and said,
No. Yeah, and what's funny about that is I am at a different stage in my life right now, and it's like my distraction is, Dad, I need more money, things like that. But this is the organic nature of life, and I remember when I interviewed my guest who was a patient, Monique Travis, and when she first introduced herself, she paused and said, "Did I do it right?" And I'm like, you know what? This is we're just having a conversation, so it's really funny. But yeah, life happens, right? So
yeah,
you do your thing, and I'm like I said, you got those three boys, so you do your thing. But go ahead and answer that calories in, calories out question.
thank you. Okay, so in terms of calories in, calories out, that way of thinking is outdated. And I know that you'll hear personal trainers still preach that and just all sorts of people preach that. But I think if we pause and think about it conceptually, say you have a Twinkie and it's 100 calories, probably more than 100 calories, but we'll say a Twinkie is 100 calories. And then you have 100 calories of broccoli. Do we really think the two process through our body the same way? I mean, just
No
think
way.
about that. Because if you're going to
No
be
way.
so simplistic and say calories in, calories out, then what you're saying is it doesn't matter what your calories come from as long as you keep them under a certain amount.
Yeah. I agree. I mean, I just think it's logical when people pause and think about it. I actually use a similar example with my patients all the time. And when they hear that example, it's like, duh, they get it, right? But they just hadn't thought about it because we only believe what we've been told.
Mhm.
And we've been told that the law of thermodynamics, which is a lab tube scenario, it does not factor in those other things that apply in your body. Rather, it's the bacteria in your gut, your metabolic rate, and all these other factors, your hormones, etc. And we learned, I remember, I'm sure you can recall when we were in school doing our obesity boards training, there was all kinds of hormones I hadn't even heard of.
Oh,
Like, what are they adiponectin? What the heck is that? So it was really interesting. So one thing I had heard you say elsewhere was this idea of gut rest. I hadn't heard anybody use that framing around fasting. So why do you use that term gut rest?
I think because initially it's easier for people to conceptualize. I think that sometimes when people hear fasting, right away they assume you're starving yourself. And that's not what you're doing. You really are just giving your body a break, specifically your gut, but your body as well, a break from having to process food. I mean, it does take work to process food. And so we have certain normal recovery functions that happen, but they only happen in a fasted state. And so, if you really never give your body time to rejuvenate, stop focusing on processing your food and all of that, so it can focus on some just general health maintenance type housekeeping functions, you're going to end up tipping the scales closer to disease rather than health.
I agree 100%. And when I had a problem with my belly, irritable belly issues, besides eating differently with low carb, the other thing that seemed to help me the most was resting my gut. Obviously, it's going to be less irritable if there's nothing there to process. So that's very helpful. A lot of people are always, surprised when they come in with gastroenteritis, and I say just stop eating, and they're like, "What do you mean?" It's like, well, you have inflammation in your GI system. So how about if you rest it for a while and we just do fluids and let it rest, and so it can recover? And it kind of makes sense when you start thinking about it. But a lot of times they hadn't thought about it. So another thing that helped me was to eat fermented foods, and I will periodically do things like kombucha. But I had heard that you, being a little Southern belle, that you like okra, and I had not heard. I know you can ferment vegetables. Don't get me wrong, but I didn't know you can ferment okra. So tell me a little bit about how that happened, and I think you said it's very tasty. Tell me a little bit about that.
It is. And oh, I'm trying to remember which book. The Art of Fermentation.
Okay, cool.
If anyone wants to delve into just the history of fermentation and then get the courage to make your own fermented foods, I highly recommend that. And so it was after I read that book and then one called Fiery Ferments, that I have a garden in our backyard. And I was like, well, let me try and just see what happens. So I started experimenting with okra. I fermented cabbage, um, made fermented salsa. I fermented garlic, just all sorts of things. And I do make my own kombucha as well.
I'm
So,
so jealous. I'm so
um,
jealous.
it is, and all these things, what I tell people just in terms of getting the courage to ferment something, honestly, it's just a glass jar, water, salt, and the vegetable that you want to ferment. That's it.
That's
And
it?
that's it. And
I thought really?
that's all fermentation is, and then you can
Oh
add different
god.
spices and different flavors. Like sometimes I'll add to my okra, I'll put in like peppers with it. Like if I just want to give it a different flavor,
Yeah.
I put curry seasoning in it, different things like that. But at its core,
Yeah.
it's just the vegetable you want to ferment, a glass jar, water covering it, and salt.
The salt does it?
Yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah, I
So
didn't even know that. I need to get that book. That's
yeah, yeah, it's that, and then, I mean, honestly, too, I'm sure Google probably has a few different just basic recipes too if you just wanna get
mhm.
started, but what I tell people when they're like, "Oh my gosh, weren't you afraid that, you know what I mean, you're gonna die or
How
something
does
from it?"
yeah, how does the salt not like I mean, I didn't see I know salt preserves, but my brain can't wrap around some jar sitting on my counter. For how long do you have to let it sit there before things get ready?
It
How
just
does that work?
depends on what you're trying
What
to
you're doing?
achieve. So
Okay.
and it depends on the ambient temperature. So in the
Okay.
dead of summer, it's going to take things less time to ferment than in
Mhm.
the winter because the warmer it is, the quicker the process goes. You also need to make sure to open the jar every day. And I don't
Oh.
leave my jars like screwed tight. I leave them a little loose because that gas will build up, and so you could
Mhm.
explode, in theory. So you want to be careful of that. But the thing that really got my confidence doing it is that fermentation has been an art that has been practiced for thousands of years.
Mm.
And I'm going to say that, in terms of resources and things like that, people thousands of years ago probably did not have the same resources that we do, but yet they were still able to preserve their food and make a food that didn't kill them, right? So, as
Yep.
long as you learn to identify what mold looks like and as long as your ferments aren't moldy and then sniff it before you eat it, like if it smells
Mhm.
bad, then don't eat it. Those basic principles. We haven't been sick yet, knock on wood. And my whole family, we keep fermented cucumbers, and I'll keep a jar in there. Once it gets to the right ferment mount, you'll put it in the refrigerator just to slow the fermentation process. But anytime
Mhm.
one of us needs an antibiotic for whatever reason, it's not that often, but occasionally we get sick. Um, we start my ferments at the same time.
Mm.
So we'll either start drinking a glass of the homemade kombucha every day, or we'll start getting the ferment or the fermented juice that I've saved out of the fridge. And I do that over any probiotic.
Excellent. Is the kombucha you make at home, how long does it last in the refrigerator? Or how much time can it be in the refrigerator?
So we have, and this has evolved over time. So we actually do a continuous brew station. So I'm really showing my nerdiness right now.
Wow. You are a nerd.
I'm a huge nerd. I'm a huge nerd. So the continuous brew station, we just keep that at room temperature. When we
Okay.
first started, I would put it into like one of those like glass jar bottles and add fruit to it and make it like
Mhm.
fizzy, just like a couple pieces of fruit because that's how you get the fizz that you'll see in the kombucha in the
Mm.
stores. But over time, we stopped doing that and adding fruit. And honestly, now we just take a wooden ladle and just dip it into the brew station. And that's
Mm.
where we get our kombucha from. We just drink it at room temp or pour it over
Mm.
ice.
Oh my God, this is a community service today. For those out there listening who have never tried this, I just think it's a great experiment. And one of the things about the social isolation that we're doing is that we're spending more time at home with family. And what a great, this sounds like so much fun for kids. Do the kids get into this?
Yeah, and you can see so the kombucha, I learned how to do that on Google. I mean, and
Mm-hmm.
yes, you got to be careful about Google with some things, but
Sure.
I learned how to do the kombucha on Google, and like it's interesting because you can actually see like the SCOBY forming, which stands for
Mm-hmm.
symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. So you can actually see it growing and making, I mean, it's a
Mhm.
living ferment. It's alive.
Wow.
And so, the kids like that. Um, we've just kind of experimented with all different things, especially during the lockdown. We not these aren't ferments, but we
Mhm.
we buy the half a cow that I mentioned. So we had the organ meat. So we experimented. The boys helped me prepare cow heart. And that,
Mm.
and I, had the heart and I showed them, I was like, look, this is what a heart looks like. And we dissected it. And I was like, these are the different valves. This is how it
Oh
pumps,
my
yada, yada,
god.
yada. So, I mean, there's, I
Amazing.
was
That's
the best part,
amazing.
but there's all sorts of stuff you can do.
Yeah, and organ meats are so healthy, so I just think that's cool. So thank you for, uh, I think you're serving your kids well because they're gonna see the world through a completely different lens. Growing up in Chicago, I thought everything came from the grocery store, so I didn't even know they had farms, I just never thought about it. You just see bacon and you don't think about it, so that's all. I was looking up something while you were talking, that I thought was interesting. It says, while okra is grown wildly in the South, it's not native to the United States. The plant most likely made it to the southern United States with the beginnings of slave trade in
Yes.
the 1500s. Wow. Okra, like rice, was one of the few crops slaves were able to bring with them from their communities in Western Africa. And just hearing that, it touches me a little bit because of my heritage and certainly yours. But and it sounds like the Africans, based on this article I'm reading, have consumed a lot of fermented foods over the years, and it's interesting just to uh, read something like that and understand the historical significance. And I think for me, when I connect the dots culturally, and I'm going to try to do that on my website at drtonyhampton.com and just say, hey, here, like one of the things I learned was that another crop, like the animal that slaves were able to own, was chicken. And, there's stereotypes about chicken, right? Well, one of the reasons why maybe that's a stereotype that exists is because that was the only crop that slaves could have, and then of course, that becomes part of what you eat. So that's very interesting stuff. So thank you for sharing. I kind of dove a little bit into this kombucha thing because of my need to protect my gut, but more importantly, I noticed that in the stores there's a lot of sugar in a lot of the kombuchas you buy. So I want to be able to make my own. So thank you for that. And one of the things that I think people, it goes back to that calories in, calories out, and I mentioned that there are hormones. So, for the audience listening, what can you say about the ghrelin and leptin hormone, what those hormones mean and how they impact our weight?
Yeah, so leptin is one, and people may hear people talk about leptin resistance or leptin deficiency. And there are some genetic disorders where if you have an absence of leptin, or if your receptors just don't respond to it at all, obesity ensues. But what leptin is supposed to do, again, when everything is functioning appropriately, it's supposed to help us feel full or help us to signal that we've had enough. And so the thought is that as you gain more fat cells, you will secrete more leptin in a hopes that it will tell other processes in your body, like, hey, maybe we're good, like we might want to decrease actually some of our body fat because we may have too much. But again, just like with insulin, when those processes get out of whack, then we're not as responsive to leptin. And so even though we may be secreting it more because we have more adipose tissue, we're not responding to it in an appropriate fashion. Ghrelin is interesting because ghrelin can stimulate hunger. You'll hear some people talk about, ghrelin can surge in levels like right before a meal, kind of that anticipation, like you see the steak in front of you, and then all of a sudden you're now like extremely hungry, but it's really just because that excitement, do you know what I mean, about getting ready to eat.
Yeah.
Also, the levels can be increased during fasting, but not necessarily sustained elevation all through your fast. So, when people are first beginning intermittent fasting, sometimes people do complain of what they think is hunger. And that, again, is probably more to do with ghrelin surging because your body was expecting that you were going to eat. It was that
Hmm.
anticipation. And you're telling your body, oh, wait, I know I usually eat every 2 to 3 hours, but today I'm going to pause and eat every 5 hours. But your body's still conditioned at that 2 hour mark. So, those are
Hmm.
some of the hormones that definitely play a role in hunger, suppressing hunger, stimulating hunger, and similarly to insulin, when those things start to get out of whack, we notice differences in our hunger cues and all sorts of things.
Yeah, and I remember when we learned about the different conditions that some kids. I actually had a kid that had a condition where they overproduce ghrelin, and I think it was Prader-Willi. That's what it
Hmm.
was,
Hmm.
and so I learned that. I knew about that because I had a patient with it, but it was interesting to have a conversation, and it must have been, I can't remember the number, but we must have had about 16 to 20 additional hormones that we had to learn about, and you don't necessarily apply them in your everyday life, but it's good to just know that we can stop blaming people and understand that there are some hormonal things going on that affect our ability to control our weight. I was thinking about that plate that you described earlier, and you did mention that a part of it was on fruit, it had fruit. And so I'm curious your thoughts about fruit in general. A lot of the people in the low carb keto space, kind of lean towards berries, and I know we were talking about in the context of pregnancy, but what's your thoughts on fruit in general?
So I think it just depends. I think when I initially started low carb, I was very reluctant to eat any sort of fruit other than, like you've already mentioned, kind of like the berries or grapefruit is, at least for me, tends to be very safe fruit for me to eat. But I would stay away from some of the other things. And then I kind of got more on board with eating things that are in season. So I don't necessarily eat fruit all year round, but again, I mentioned I have a garden, so if I can grow it in my backyard, all within moderation, I will eat it when it's in season, when I'm growing it myself. And I've kind of found that that works well for me, but what that means is that I basically have a month period every year where I'll have watermelon. And then for the next 11 months, I don't have it because it's not growing naturally in my region, if that makes sense. And so I do think, in the past, we were able to, fruit wasn't imported all year round. To be honest, many people in the United States probably weren't eating things like pineapples and mangoes, even though I'm not saying, good or bad, but if they weren't in your climate, right, you weren't eating them. And so that's kind of the approach I try to take, is that if this is a fruit that I could not get regularly or in season right now in the environment that I live in day out, then I'm going to wait and have that when it's in season. And even so, when it's in season, that doesn't mean that my breakfast, lunch, and dinner consist of it. That means that's my dessert. So I tend to treat fruit like dessert rather than having a processed dessert. And I find by doing that, I don't have dessert every day, right?
Yep.
That then it's not really a treat if you have it every day. And I find that that combined with fasting usually works well for me.
Yep.
I tell people initially that they can have like a small portion of fruit on their plate, but that shouldn't be the majority of your plate. And if you're still hungry, you should then be going back for protein or vegetables. And I think it's just because, again, when we're trying to transition somebody to a new lifestyle, it's hard for some people to cut everything out. So, what I do is try to reduce their portions of the macros that I think are probably the most detrimental to their health.
Yeah, I think I love that. And I did. I made a YouTube video, which was basically entitled, fruit, is it a health food or a snack food? And I think we kind of know the answer. You've already answered the question, but that doesn't mean that we don't eat fruit. I think all of these things are to be enjoyed. What I tell patients, let's get you metabolically healthy first. And we'll be a little bit more restrictive at first because, maybe, I see that their kidney function starting to be impacted. And then once we get them metabolically healthy, we get a little bit more flexible. I think that unless we're talking about a person that has, trying to get nutritional ketosis because they have epilepsy, for example, those people really do want to have tight control, remain in a nice place where they can control their seizures. They may even have to know what the macronutrients are, how much fat, how much protein, blah, blah, blah. But for the average person, the key is just reduce the carbs. But reduce doesn't mean no carbs. That means that, yes, you can have a slice of watermelon and, whatever that carb number is, 15 to 20, whatever it is, and you look at your totality of carbs for the day and decide. And if you're healthy and you're doing well, maybe you don't need to be under 50 carbs. Maybe you can be under 70 carbs. I mean, whatever that number is, but I think I like what you're saying. Individualize it. Now, some people also get a little bit of a spike from smoothies. So are smoothies a reasonable alternative to food sometimes? What's your thoughts on smoothies? Are you a pro or avoid smoothies person?
So I'm kind of anti smoothies, and my brother and I argue this point all the time, and we will continue to argue it until we are both very.
Is your brother a regular lay person, or does he have any expertise in the nutrition world?
He was a college athlete, so he didn't,
Okay.
nutrition wasn't his degree or anything, but a large part of being able to be, a Division I NCAA
That's right.
athlete is going to
You got
be
that
some
right.
form of nutrition. So
That's right. Okay.
he likes his smoothies. He loves them. For the reason I have an issue with smoothies is because I find that people, again, if we're talking about fruit, and we're not going to say, fruit is the end all, never have it. But when I've seen smoothies made in the past, sometimes people are putting 2 or 3 bananas in them, you know, a quart full of, maybe not a quart, but you know what I mean, a ton of strawberries and things like that. Where if you were to try to eat all of those things individually in its whole form in the day, you wouldn't be able to eat that much fruit. Do you know what I mean? I don't know many people who will eat 3 or 4 bananas in a day, 2 or 3 cups of strawberries in a day. You know what I mean? And all of those
Yeah.
things. But when you
Mm-hmm.
blend it up, you are still consuming that much, but now you've put it in a form where your body doesn't initially recognize that you're eating that much of it. And so you really have no impetus for your body to tell you stop until you've already consumed, 16 ounces or whatever.
Okay.
So that is my bias against smoothies. My brother's argument would be that he doesn't put that much fruit in his smoothies. His really are a method to get more vegetables in,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
which is fine. But then I guess I'm also like you could just cook those vegetables and eat them. So I mean,
Right.
it's one or the other. But when I see most people make smoothies, they're not making them like my brother does, where
Right.
really the majority are vegetables, and they just put a
Mm-hmm.
few strawberries in it, so it doesn't taste like just blended kale,
Right.
which that doesn't
Right.
sound good to me.
It does
And
not taste good.
yeah,
Yeah.
most people are doing very little green and tons of fruit, and you're just consuming more than what you would do naturally if you ate it in a full form.
Right. That's true. And I do know that people who are athletic may be metabolically in better shape to tolerate that. And maybe if he's still athletic, he's going to burn it off anyway. So maybe that's I think with him being an athlete like that, that's his brain is wired differently. But man, that's like what percentage of the population is doing what he's doing? Very few.
Very
So I think
small.
so I think the people we see in clinic, we have to give them a different message. So that makes a lot of sense. Another thing people ask about is, okay, I'm fasting, I'm sacrificing, doc. So when I'm not eating, that's fine. But when it's time to eat, I can eat what I want to. So how do you advise people about, okay, when it's time to eat, is it okay to eat what they want to eat?
So it's still about retraining people's frame of mind, because I kind of do the analogy that you're treading water, right? So if you're just going to eat again a bunch of processed stuff all the time after you fast, then basically your fast is just removing or trying to keep up with that new processed food that you're eating, but you haven't given your body any time to actually delve deeper to correcting your metabolic health, if that makes sense. So it's kind of like you have a canoe and it has a few holes in it. So you got a bucket. You can keep up with it and you're not going to sink, right? Because they're just a few holes. But at the same time, you're not really making any progress. And so
Yeah.
I still think it is important to address your diet. Now, fasting will allow some people to have more carbs than
Mm-hmm.
what they may be able to have if they weren't fasting. So I
Mm-hmm.
have seen, especially for myself, I mean, I've seen myself, and as I've become more metabolically healthy, if my goal is to be in ketosis, I can be in ketosis with regular intermittent fasting
Mm-hmm.
and eating between 50 to 75 grams of carbs a day. And I know people are like, that's
Yeah.
not possible, but it actually is, because it's
Yeah.
individualized and I fast regularly. And then
Right.
when I'm eating, I'm not replenishing my body with a lot of processed food. So that gives me more metabolic flexibility. But I definitely think that when you start fasting, you should also address your diet. Again, you may not change everything at once, but you should be mindful of at least trying to decrease your processed carbohydrates.
Okay. And do you guys fuss about supplements like, um, you watch the YouTube videos and the real muscular guys, so you got to take these amino acid supplements and things like this before exercising? Do you and your brother have conversations around, taking supplements like the proteins and things like that? And is it better to do that in a fasted state if you're going to exercise, or do you have conversations around that topic?
So I think a lot of it depends on your athletic level of exercise, because exercise can be two totally different demands on the body. Do you know what I mean? Depending on the individual. But in general, I don't advocate for amino acid supplements or ketone supplements or things like that. Because the premise is to use your own body for fuel. And most of us have enough stores to use our body for fuel. Now, in terms of protein supplementation, depending on what types of workouts you're doing, you may need to do that. Again, I don't. I tend to get my protein from my food, just because I feel like my protein intake is high quality. But if you are going to use supplements with your workout, I tend to say do it after your workout, because there are benefits to resistance training in a fasted state. Just think Terry Crews. And so, you don't need a pre workout fuel.
Okay, that makes sense. So I love all of the topics we're covering, and I wish we can meet more people on Twitter. I don't see a lot of diversity on Twitter, which is where I meet a lot of people that have become my guests and who I also mutually follow. I'm curious how you feel. Well, let me ask you this. I actually spoke with Low Carb USA recently, and I love the work that Tim Noakes Foundation is doing, because there was kind of a breakout session, and we talked a little bit about how in communities that had limited resources, they were able to creatively think of ways to reach those communities and give them dietary advice, and it actually was moving the needle. I'll probably do a similar thing with the churches, and I'll probably, in fact, I got a church to speak at this weekend, and I'll talk about lifestyle things. So I'm just curious, your thoughts on how we can reach communities of color, underserved communities, because they're the ones who are the most metabolically uh, ill, and I want to make sure we reach them as well. So what's your thoughts on how to do that?
I think one, churches is an excellent place to start, because especially if you can get time, towards the end of service, or even if they'll host an event, I think a church is very central to many communities. And so being able to have someone speak in that setting, I find, especially for me, I try to link fasting with the Bible,
Hmm.
because
Yeah.
fasting is discussed all throughout the Bible.
Hmm.
And so it is something, whether you're Christian, Muslim, what have you, most major religions talk about fasting. And it's
Hmm.
something that we've gotten away from. So just the simple art of combining fasting with prayer helps you to get at the mindfulness component, which now we know that there are scientific basis for mindfulness, right? And then it
Hmm.
helps you get at the fasting component, which we know there's scientific basis for that as well. So if you can find ways to point towards strengthening one's faith through things that also help improve your lifestyle, I really think that is a common ground that most people can acknowledge and start there.
Yeah, I think we all have a spiritual side. Even a non-believer has a spiritual side, and it's a different belief, but I think we all connect that way. So I think, connecting with people and showing those connections spiritually is a great way to go. And certainly you can do that with everybody. The golden rule, a Bible phrase, treat others like you want to be treated. You don't have to be a spiritual person to understand that. That makes a lot of sense. So I really appreciate those comments. And I really appreciate you because not only are you doing your high risk OB work, and you're doing your intermittent fasting work, and you're doing your obesity work, you're doing all of these things while having now 3 beautiful kids, a husband who's there to support you. And you have any pets or anything like that?
We have two cats.
Yes. Okay, cool. So you got 2 cats. And, I've never had pets before, but um, we had a crayfish, but my goal is my goal is to and it's funny to say that because I went to school in New Orleans, and we ate a lot of crawfish. So but anyway, I was just curious about that. So I think as we kind of wrap up, I'll ask you the question that is clear. I think when it comes to that nest and rope and the things that you're going to work on, whether it's nutrition, exercise, less stress, more sleep, avoiding trauma, how you think, making sure the relationship's okay, avoiding organisms, pollution, and making sure your emotions and your life experiences serve you in a positive way. I know you got the N pretty down. I mean, we talked about the N most of the conversation, and that includes nutrition and intermittent fasting. What part of the nest and rope are like a big focus for you right now? Where are you trying to move with that in the next year?
I think in terms of I still focus, a lot on the nutrition and the intermittent fasting because I think those are things for most people that are most in their control immediately, right? Even um you control when you eat, right? I mean that is something in your control. You're either eating or you're not, right? And
Yeah.
your choice, assuming that food scarcity is not an issue, you do choose the type of things that you purchase. You're the one going to the grocery store. So those are things you control. What I would like to start focusing more on, or at least incorporate more, are the things that seem out of our control and how we let those factors impact our stress and our spirit. I think that is a key that we don't necessarily discuss enough. Just the various stressors, from fears of police brutality, things with the justice system, whether we're looking at just violence in general or trauma. Those are things that we internalize and also affect us, even if we're not necessarily aware of that on the outside. So I think making sure that we're finding ways to decompress and practice mindfulness, so that it doesn't necessarily, you don't get to a point where you feel like the weight of the world is on your shoulders. Because if you're feeling like that, you really aren't going to have time to really think about your nutrition, your exercise, your meal timing, and things like that.
Right.
So,
That's right. Excellent. And man, it's like I think I was having a discussion recently about resetting the thermostat, and my expectations are different now because we're in a pandemic. And I have to do video visits all day tomorrow. I'll be at home on Tuesdays and Thursdays at this point. So I have to set a different thermostat. I have to have different expectations. And by setting a different expectation, it doesn't stress me out. So that's excellent. I really appreciate you spending some time with me on YouTube and now with the podcast. And again, thank your beautiful boys and your husband for gifting us today with your voice. And I really appreciate that. So thank you.
yes, thank you for having me. And yes, Mike, my husband, he definitely is very supportive, and the reason that I can do even a fraction, of what I do,
Right.
especially with having a demanding work schedule and then
That's
being
right.
able to do this in the after hours. So yes,
Yeah.
definitely thankful to him.
And speaking of that, before I give a final comment, what's the best way for people to find you and other doctors who specialize in intermittent fasting and fasting?
Yeah, so I have a website. It's thefastingdoctor.com. If you're looking for me either on Pinterest, Facebook, Instagram, it's The Fasting Doctor. And then on Twitter, it's just Fasting Doctor. My website also has information. If you're looking to find a physician that believes in fasting in your area, you can find them on my website. And then um, also, I think we had mentioned earlier, Diet Doctor is a great
Yep.
resource. And then also the Metabolic Multiplier website as well is going to have some great information there if you're looking for someone in your area. So those are all resources that you can check out. I definitely think the medical community is starting to be a little more open to lifestyle interventions. And so hopefully you'll be able to find a physician near you that can partner with you in your journey towards health.
Yeah, well, thank you again. And I agree that the number of physicians and other clinicians in this space of metabolic health is growing. And we're going to do our best to stand on the rooftop and support this expansion of clinicians who understand this, because I think we'll save a lot of lives. So thank you again for being here today. And I just want to say that today we were gifted with a great discussion from a great doctor and a great human being. And hopefully the many topics we touched on today will help you fill some of the gaps in knowledge you may have been seeking. And for those who were expecting a conversation with the fasting doctor focused only on fasting, no worries. Just check out the show notes for a link to the YouTube and Facebook Live we did just before our conversation got started. So as we wrap up this episode, continue your journey of continuous learning and promise to do all the things that your family deserves to be healthy. And what I'll do is promise to make sure I'll continue to share great guests and great information and help us all work towards metabolic health. So until next time, be well and make sure to protect your nest. You've been listening to Protecting Your Nest with Dr. Tony Hampton. For more, visit drtonyhampton.com.